The Social War, also known as the War of the Allies, was a pivotal engagement that shook the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. Lasting from 91 to 88 BC, it erupted primarily due to the grievances of the Italian allies, who sought Roman citizenship and their equal rights. The war reshaped the political landscape of Italy, leading to significant changes in Roman governance and military dynamics, but not without significant bloodshed. Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, it's good to meet you, and if you are coming back, it's great to see you again. If you'd like to support my work on YouTube, you may follow the links to the Patreon. Otherwise, if you feel inclined to like, comment, and subscribe, that also goes a very long way. Now, without further ado, let's begin our video on the Social War. First of all, let's have a look at the name. You see, the term social war is somewhat of an inadequate translation of the Latin term bellum sociale, which actually means War of the Allies in Latin, derived from socius, meaning ally. Now, in contemporary scholarship, social war is commonly used to describe any conflict between allies, so this is more of a blanket term. Now, the term bellum sociale was coined by historian Florus in the 2nd century AD, gaining popularity during the imperial period. During the time of the Romans, it was also known as the Marsic War, named after the Marsi, an Italian tribe east of Rome, who were prominent in the conflict, having even killed 2 Roman consuls. You might also hear it referred to as the Italian War. Now, the focus on the Marsi tribe could be attributed to figures like Quintus Poppaedius Silo, a leader among the Italians. So, with that out of the way, let's get right back to the start. Talk about the roots of the conflict and the situation in Rome and broader Italy that led us to this point. During the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic held sway over the Italian peninsula, forming alliances through bilateral treaties with numerous city-states across the region. These agreements typically guaranteed the territorial integrity and self-governance of the allied cities, but of course in exchange for their military support in Rome's various conflicts. Now, as Rome grew, it engaged in more and more wars, and it needed more soldiers to fuel the machine. The contribution of allied contingents to its military grew quite significantly. By 295 BC, Allied forces outnumbered the Roman troops on the battlefield, and by 218, there were 3 allies for every 2 Romans. Cities allied with Rome for various reasons, including the promise of war spoils and land allocations. Moreover, Rome provided support to allied elites who were facing popular uprisings, such as those in Arretium, Lucania, and Volsini in 302, 296, and 264 respectively. While some cities defected during the Second Punic War, following the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, Rome quashed these defections and imposed severe penalties, making an example of anybody who stepped out of line. Well, little by little, over time, Roman interference in the internal affairs of its allies increased. although historians do debate the extent of this intervention. For instance, the Senate's actions to suppress the Bacchanalia in 186 BC raises questions about whether it applied solely to Roman territory or extended extraterritorially to the allies. Now, during the Social War, the Allied forces primarily hailed from regions such as Etruria and Umbria in the north, as well as territories further south, including Lucania, Apulia, and Magna Graecia. As early as the 5th century BC, going way back, Oscan and Umbrian-speaking communities in southern Italy had already established somewhat of a loose confederacy, with notable powers like the Samnites and Lucians emerging as key players. Despite conquests in Italy, these allies, particularly the Samnites, maintained their unity and defected from Rome as a unified front during the Second Punic War. Roman influence and the process of Romanization varied from region to region. While Latin had little impact on Apulia and Samnium, Marsic territories showed signs of adopting the Latin alphabet, indicating somewhat of a degree of cultural assimilation. Overall, the Italian tribes at large and their communities did remain somewhat distinct from Rome, at least on the eve of the Social War, and they preserved their identities as much as they had in the preceding centuries. Must remember, not everybody wanted to be Roman. Now, before the 1st century AD, individuals could not hold multiple citizenships, and allied soldiers did not receive Roman citizenship upon completing their service prior to the establishment of the empire. This single citizenship system contrasted with the practice in Greece, where multiple citizenships were common. Citizenship was closely tied to territories, with acquiring Roman citizenship necessitating the forfeiture of local citizenship. Losing local citizenship while residing outside Roman territory often led to a decline in social and economic status for individuals. And here's a term for you: the Italian question encapsulates the complex dynamic between Rome and its Italian allies during the Social War. It's been debated these primary motivations behind the Allies' revolt, with the two main perspectives emerging from ancient accounts. One viewpoint portrays the conflict as a struggle for citizenship, while the other depicts it as a rebellion against Roman hegemony. Some modern observers suggest that the Social War should be interpreted primarily as a revolt against Rome. However, we may also acknowledge that both the quest for citizenship and desire for independence reflect somewhat of a deeper aspiration for equality and freedom, whether within or outside of the Roman political framework. Now, a source from Appian, entitled Civil Wars, serves as a primary one for understanding much of the Social War period, offering valuable insights. According to Appian, the Italians were driven by several key themes. Among them were support for agrarian reform, political equality, but also aspirations for land distribution. One notable aspect that is highlighted by Appian is the association of agrarian reforms with the plight of the Italians. He suggests that the reforms proposed by figures like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were perceived as potential means to address the grievances of the Italian population. However, modern historians question the validity of this claim, viewing it as either a political tactic or an anachronistic insertion by later commenters. Well, Appian also portrays the war as a response to the failed reform efforts of Marcus Livius Drusus in 91. Drusus's proposed changes to the composition of criminal court juries allegedly involved promises of free land, which ultimately failed to materialize. It was this failure, according to Appian, that fueled the Italians' quest for citizenship and legal equality, which they believed had been denied to them in times of peace. While Appian presents various motivations for the revolt, the desire for political equality in general emerges as the central theme. He suggests, in his work, that the Italians sought to be partners in rule rather than subjects. However, it is likely that different segments of Italian society harbored their own goals, with poorer Italians seeking relief from mistreatment by Roman authorities, and wealthier individuals aimed for direct involvement in Roman politics. Modern interpretations of the citizenship thesis emphasize the role of Italian commercial classes in driving Romanization efforts. These scholars argue that access to Roman citizenship would enable all Italians to share in the benefits of the empire, and also influence Roman provincial policies. However, alternative perspectives, such as the overall economic factor, may have also played a significant role in sparking the conflict. Overall, it's a mixed bag. Now, scholarly analysis challenges the traditional view of the social war's motivations. It suggests that the desire for Roman citizenship among the Italian allies that is depicted by Appian may simply be anachronistic. You see, before the conflict, there was limited agitation for citizenship, and the implications of such citizenship reforms would have been extensive, potentially disrupting the long-standing alliance system that formed the basis of Roman dominance in Italy. Instead, focus is more played on the Italian discontent with Roman public land reforms. Well, a proposed reconstruction of the events leading to the war suggests that the Roman politicians, to perhaps placate the plebs through land distributions, led to increased unrest among the allies. A raw deal, it seems. The failure to address these grievances culminated in a confrontation between the Roman leaders and the allies, prompting preparations for insurrection. Efforts to grant citizenship to appease the allies ultimately failed, and it led to the launch of the Italian bid for independence. This decision to rebel against Rome was certainly a significant gamble for the Italians, as demonstrated by the brutal reprisal against Fregale following his attempted revolt in 125 BC. To prepare for war, the Italians needed to establish trustworthy alliances, often secured with the exchange of hostages. Appian also recounts a series of somewhat clandestine negotiations among Italian states that were, for a long time, completely unbeknownst to Rome. Although the Romans may have been aware of some unrest, they likely underestimated its extent. The capture of Roman garrisons in unfriendly cities at the outset of the war suggests a rather poor strategic planning by the Romans and prior strategic planning by the Italians. Roman authorities had dispatched praetors with troops to investigate the rumors of dissent around the peninsula by late 91 BC. However, these efforts were either insufficient or simply too late, as the war had already begun by the time their investigations concluded. It's probable that preparations for rebellion had been underway prior to Drusus's tribunate in 91 BC. At the onset of the war, Italians swiftly raised forces and organized armies to confront the Romans, indicating prior agreements on power sharing and command. Now, according to Photius's summary of Diodorus Siculus, which aligns with the views of the majority of modern scholars, the Italians established a new capital at Corfinium, complete with their own senate of about 500 members, and they even appointed 2 consuls and 12 praetors. These officials were evenly divided between the northern and southern fronts, with Quintus Poppaedius Silo and Gaius Papius Mutilus appointed as consuls for the north and south respectively. Reconstructions of the Italian state organization have varied over time. Early interpretations proposed a structure akin to Roman governance, while later views suggest a more federal arrangement with tribal divisions. Some modern observers suggest that Livy's account of the Latin War, albeit anachronistic, may offer some different insights into the social war, indicating Italian demands for power-sharing arrangements akin to those sought by the Latin allies in the earlier conflicts. However, apart from the account of Diodorus Siculus, there is limited evidence regarding the internal politics or officers of the Italian coalition. Florus, for instance, makes no mention of an Italian senate or magistrates, instead referring to tribal and ethnic leaders serving under their respective standards. The presence of imperatores, or commanders, among the Italians implies a decentralized leadership structure, with very little evidence of formal elections or even succession protocols. Now, in late 91, or perhaps early 90 BC in the winter time, a significant incident occurred in Asculum, where a Roman praetor named Quintus Servilius, possibly the quaestor of 103 BC, intervened in a customary hostage exchange between Asculum and another city, threatening violence if Asculum was to continue. In response, fearing Roman reprisal, the inhabitants of Asculum killed the praetor and his legate Fonteius, along with all of the Romans in the city, and looted their belongings as well for good measure. Well, this was not received well. This act of violence against Romans openly triggered a widespread revolt among the Italians. However, it may have been different, as this sequence contradicts Appian's narrative, which does suggest that Asculum rioted in late 91 BC, but following the assassination of Marcus Livius Drusus in Rome, and also due to the general atmosphere of persecution of the Italian allies which everybody was quite rightly sick of at this point. According to Appian, Drusus, whose political influence had waned since the death of his powerful supporter, Lucius Licinius Crassus, saw his legislation invalidated by the Senate before being killed by an unknown assailant. Subsequently, the Italians sent a delegation to Rome, but negotiations were refused. Appian then asserts that after the death of Drusus and the prosecution of their allies in Rome, the Equites established the Varian court to prosecute those aiding the Italians' quest for citizenship. This, Appian claims, led to the Italian conspiracy and revolt. However, once again, given the time frame between Drusus's death and the outbreak of the war, this chronology that Appian puts forth appears somewhat implausible. But it is just another take on the early events. With the beginning of the social war being well defined, its conclusion remains somewhat ambiguous, with proposed end dates ranging from 89 BC to perhaps November of 82 BC. Well, what we are going to cover is the events until the nominal pacification of the Samnites and Lucanians in 87. Well, the primary sources for the war's course are a little convoluted. Appian presents them geographically, resulting in a bit of a disjointed narrative, while Livy's chronology is obscured by the loss of his original volumes. But we'll do our best. Oh, and additionally, the conflict unfolded against two main theatres. One was in the north, centered in Asculum, and the other in the south, encompassing Samnium, Lucania, Apulia, and Campania. Additionally, there was a brief but unsuccessful attempt to foment rebellion in Etruria and Umbria, but the Romans swept that one up with relative ease. Now, after these events that led to the initial massacres of the Romans and the Italian allies banding together and putting their plan in motion, in Rome, the initial response to the rebellion was marked by confusion. Plebeian tribune Quintus Varius Hybrida established a permanent court to identify the conspirators behind the Italian uprising. However, the Romans did not initially perceive a direct link between the issue of citizenship and the outbreak of the war. There are suggestions of a potential peace negotiation in the early winter of 90 BC, but if such talks did occur, the Senate ultimately refused to engage in serious negotiations. Now, Appian reports that at the outset of the war, the Italians had quite a lot behind them. He reports that they had mobilized around 100,000 men. While on the other side, Rome's Latin allies had remained loyal. Rome retained control over strategic areas like Capua and central Campania. The consuls for the year, Lucius Julius Caesar and Publius Rutilius Lupus, were supported by rather experienced legates, including Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, both very battle-hardened men. They knew what to do when commanding an army. Well, in response to all of this, these numbers of 100,000 angry peasants, Rome mustered their own substantial force, allowing the consuls of 90 BC to swiftly depart for battle. All consuls and praetors were assigned to Italy for the duration of this conflict. Livy's records detail the Latin and foreign communities that contributed auxiliaries to Rome's cause, and they certainly did their part. Estimates suggest that Rome's manpower exceeded 140,000 men, with resources split among 14 legions and additional support from overseas allies. Now the Italians, with all of their side, were on the offensive. Launched in late 91 and early 90 BC, they demonstrated a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of Roman military tactics. Must have been looking over the fence while they were training. Well, of course, a lot of them were veterans of past wars. Naturally, they would know what the Romans were going to do, especially going up against a quote-unquote inferior force. Notably, there was a concerted effort to win over the pro-Roman combatants, resulting in significant defection from Roman ranks. Remember how he said that much of the Roman army was composed of auxiliaries from other areas. Victories were achieved in various regions, with notable successes in Campania and Picenum. In Campania, Italian forces under Gaius Papius Mutilus captured key cities before being halted at Acre. Meanwhile, in Picenum, Gaius Vindicilius and others defeated Roman forces and advanced into Apulia, seizing territory along the eastern coast. Despite initial setbacks for Rome, the conflict remained indecisive in many engagements, with Acernia falling after repeated Roman failures to relieve the besieged town. Lucius Julius Caesar, and he was attempting to halt Italian advances at Acre, and he was doing well, but unfortunately it resulted in a series of inconclusive battles. But quite a learning experience for the young commander. In the northern theatre, on June 11th, during the Battle of the Tilenus River, Consul Publius Rutilius Lupus fell while attempting to lead his men across the river. His under-trained troops were routed during the crossing, leading to panic when the large number of bodies returned to Rome. In response to this, to try and quell some public outcry, the Senate decreed that the war dead should, instead of being paraded through the middle of town, buried on the field of battle in future, saving everybody from that hit to morale, I think. Now Gaius Marius, another of Rutilius's legates, managed to secure a decisive victory by forcing the river and assuming command after Rutilius's replacement was assassinated during a false surrender negotiations. Marius, with assistance from Lucius Cornelius Sulla, later defeated Marsic near the Fucine Lake, splitting the Italian forces. Meanwhile, Sextus Julius Caesar, consul in 91 BC, moved to relieve Firmum in October. His forces routed Labrenius's troops, driving them into Asculum, which was then besieged by Pompey Strabo. Sextus's forces also pushed Vindiculus back into Apulia, placing it under siege in December. These victories led to the collapse of the northern front of the war. Attempts to incite rebellion in Etruria and Umbria were also quickly suppressed, and the Senate garrisoned Cumae with freed men recruited into the army for the first time. with the northern front collapsing and the division of Italian forces, defeat for the Italians became somewhat inevitable. As Rome began to gain the upper hand, the Senate passed legislation in October allowing Italian communities that had not revolted to elect Roman citizenship, known as the Lex Julia de Civitate. This addressed one of the main grievances that was behind the war, albeit after the bodies had piled up. Too little, too late, it seems. Well, despite these developments, only the Italian hardliners remained on the battlefield, and their resistance was gradually overcome by the superior Roman force. In 89, the new consuls were Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo and Lucius Porcius Cato. In January, the Marsi attempted to support the rebellions in Etruria and Umbria, but were intercepted by the consuls. Strabo defeated them rather soundly near Asculum, forcing a retreat across the snowy mountains, while Cato, taking command from Marius, defeated them near the Fucine Lake, but he was killed in battle. The Romans continued their offensive against the Marsi, eventually forcing them to petition for peace, and this allowed the Romans to besiege Asculum and Corfinium, forcing the Italians to transfer their capital to Bovianum. The Romans also made the effort to subjugate the Vestini and the Marrucini, pacifying the northern theater pretty much by summer. Now back to the south. That was where Sulla was, and he was making his own impact. He besieged Nola and Pompeii, defeating attempts to relieve them. He then moved into Samnium, subjugating the Hirpini and taking Bovianum by September, forcing the Italians to relocate their capital to Isernia. So by this time, the northern front and the southern front, well, the writing was on the wall for the Italians, it seems. Asculum surrendered in the November of 89 BC, and Strabo celebrated a triumph on December 25th. Merry Christmas. Further legislation extended citizenship with the Lex Plautia Papiria, and new colonies in Transdapane Gaul were established with Latin rights and privileges. The reorganization of Italy continued with the formation of new municipia and the surveying of their lands. Now, by 88 BC, the social war was more or less concluded. And yes, there was perhaps a few people still knocking about, but there was only really a few pockets of resistance remaining. And by this point, they weren't so tough. Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Quintus Pompeius Rufus were elected at this time as consuls, but neither was assigned to commands against the Italians due to new concerns about Mithridates VI's invasion of Asia. Pompey Strabo's command in the northern theatre was extended, and he quickly accepted the surrender of several Italian towns, effectively ending the war in the north. The remaining insurgents fled south to Samnium and Apulia, where they reorganized under Quintus Poppaedius Silo. Now Silo still had some force behind him, and he had about 50,000 men. But his efforts, despite valiant, were insufficient against the Romans. he did manage to reverse Roman advances in Samnium and recapture Bovianum, before being defeated and killed by Metellus Pius in Apulia. All in all, a valiant effort. Well, after Silo's death, organized resistance completely collapsed, although a few people did fight on in Brutium, but it was game over at this point. They sought the intervention, these last holdouts, from Mithridates, remember him? But ultimately reached a negotiated settlement with the Roman government in 87 BC, siding with the faction of Cornelius Cinna and Gaius Marius, in exchange for citizenship and other concessions. So they did get a few things of what they wanted. It wasn't a complete waste of time. Well, perhaps tell that to the giant pile of dead bodies. The social war extended a significant toll on both sides, with the need for soldiers leading to the induction of freed men into the Roman army, and the unprecedented financial strain on the Republic. The devastation was profound. Fighting in their own backyard, particularly in central and southern Italy, and we know this by the archaeological evidence along with the literary sources that describe complete misery and lawlessness all over the countryside. Moreover, the extension of citizenship to the Allies changed the political and legal landscape of Italy. Former sovereign Italian communities were all but replaced by Roman citizen municipia, governed by uniform magistrates, and their laws, well, they were Roman laws now. While the process of municipalization evolved over time, it culminated in the establishment of a more standardized system under Caesar and Augustus. In the following year, 88 BC, during Lucius Cornelius Sulla's consulship, a significant issue arose regarding the enrollment of newly enfranchised Italian citizens into the Roman tribes. The expansion of citizenship following the social war raised questions about how these citizens would be politically organized, as their placement in the 35 tribes of the Comitia Tributa would influence politics for generations to come. Initially, proposals suggested creating new tribes to accommodate the influx of new citizens, a solution reminiscent of practices in the past. However, some advocated for integrating the new citizens into the existing tribes, which would ensure their full political influence. This debate culminated in legislation proposed by Publius Sulpicius Rufus, a tribune of the plebs, which aimed to enroll the new citizens in the existing tribes. This proposal was later revoked when Sulla marched on Rome in response to a reassignment regarding the Mithridatic command. After Cornelius Cinna took control of Rome and supported the Italian suffrage, the decision was made to redistribute the new citizens among the old tribes. This process began somewhat later in 70 BC with the election of new censors, but its completion was delayed, likely due to Rome's deliberate inaction, and was not finalized all the way until the reign of Augustus. The impact that these new Italian citizens on Rome had was quite significant. They formed a concentrated electorate with their own vested interests, or they often sold their votes to the highest bidders, and there were plenty of them. Additionally, their distribution across Italy empowered the magnates close to Rome, whose votes became valuable commodities in various political dealings. The influence of these Italian citizens was evident in legislative actions, such as the recall of Cicero from exile in 58 BC, which was supported by Italian landowners who had been granted citizenship during the Social War. This highlights the role of Italian enfranchisement in supporting political champions and shaping Roman politics. But more to the immediate aftermath of the Social War, which set the stage for continued conflict and political upheaval. The dispute over enfranchisement persisted, driving support for figures like Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who positioned himself as a champion for the Italians during the Bellum Octavianum. Concerns arose that Sulla might revoke citizenship's right granted by Cinna-era legislation, and this fueled tensions and contributed to preparations for civil war against Sulla. Now, the war's impact on politics was also profound. It brought large-scale military campaigning back to Italian soil, creating opportunities for new generals to seize power. Sulla's exploitation of standing armies in Italy to usurp control demonstrated this shifting dynamic of power within the Republic. However, the conflict politicized the Roman army and eroded civil military norms, leading to many defections, lax discipline, and even mutinies. The blurred distinction between Romans and foreign enemies during the war continued to a breakdown in loyalty to the state among soldiers. This rift between the common soldiery and Roman voters further destabilized the Republic, making its victory in the Social War a somewhat precarious one. Ultimately, the conflict paved the way for figures like Sulla to assert dominance, marking a significant shift in Roman political history. And there you have it, the Social War. A war that's often forgotten, not one of the popular rebellions, but with a line such as Rome versus Italy certainly piques a few ears up. Well, thank you very much for listening. I would like to say thank you to my Mega Chad tier patrons. First, Stark Factory, and second, a new Mega Chad tier patron and a great friend to the channel, Joseph Grubb. Thank you very much, Joseph, and welcome aboard the train. There are no breaks. I would like to thank the listeners as well for getting this far in the video. Good effort. And if you would like to support the channel in the same way as Stark Factory and Joseph Grubb do so, then you need only follow the links to the Patreon in the description. But until I see you next time, I wish you all the best. Good night, everyone. See you in the next video.